Indeed, if there is an anti-Tory majority after May the 7th, we will vote to stop a new Tory government even getting off the ground. But we will then seek to use our influence positively and constructively to make a Labour government bolder and better. We will seek to make common cause and build alliances with others of like mind across the UK to deliver the progressive change that so many want to see. And we will bring to that task 8 years' experience of government, of successful, effective and stable government. It was, after all, as a minority government in Scotland that the SNP restored free education, abolished prescription charges and froze the council tax. We will use that experience in a minority-led House of Commons to advance progressive policies that will benefit people in all parts of the UK. So to everyone who, like me, wants this election to herald the real and positive change that will make life better for ordinary people across these islands, I hold out a hand of friendship. The SNP, if we are given the chance, will be your allies in making that change. The manifesto we published today sets out our priorities for progressive change. It is a manifesto, above all else, to end austerity. That will be our #1 priority. I say loudly and clearly today that it is time to end the needless pain of Tory cuts. In the last 5 years, austerity has undermined our public services. It has lowered the living standards of working people. It has pushed more children into poverty, and it has held back economic growth. It hasn't even succeeded on its own terms. Over the last Parliament, the Chancellor missed all of his own fiscal targets. When a policy is failing, it is time to change that policy. That is why we are putting forward today a clear alternative to the further spending cuts proposed by both Labour and the Tories. We want to see modest spending increases by the equivalent of increasing departmental spending by 0.5% above inflation in each year of the next Parliament. Under our proposal, the deficit and the national debt will still fall in each year, but a slightly slower path to eliminating the deficit completely will allow at least £140 billion extra to be invested in infrastructure and support for business, in protecting our vital public services and in policies that will help to lift people out of poverty. We will also back fair proposals to raise extra revenue. It's right that those with the broadest shoulders pay a little bit more. That's why we will back the restoration of the 50p tax rate for the highest earners, a mansion tax and a banker's bonus tax. And when money is so tight, we believe it to be all the more important that we use our voice and our votes to make sure that we do not squander scarce resources on new nuclear weapons. We will seek to build an alliance in the House of Commons against the renewal of Trident, and we will vote for the £100 billion that would be saved to be invested instead in education, better childcare and the National Health Service. That's how we will spend that money. Our plans for modest spending increases, fair taxes and setting the right priorities for spending will mean that we can invest in growing our economy and strengthening our society. It will mean that we can give the NHS the funding that it needs. Over the past week, Labour has failed to commit to the money England's NHS needs. And while the Tories have given a commitment, they have no idea where the money is coming from. Increasing health spending while cutting overall spending by £30 billion, as the Tories plan to do, will mean even more savage cuts to social care, social security and local government, all of which pile extra pressure on the NHS. Both Labour and the Tories are selling the NHS short. Our plans mean that we, the SNP, can make this clear commitment to the NHS across the whole of the UK. We will vote for an increase in health spending across the UK of £24 billion by 2020-2021, £9.5 billion above inflation. That will meet in full the challenge set out in the report of the NHS Chief Executive in England, the Stevens report, and it will deliver a total increase to the budget of NHS Scotland of £2 billion by 2021, and it will ensure that our NHS enters the next decade fully equipped for the challenges that it faces. I also give a commitment today that SNP MPs, in order to protect Scotland's budget, will vote against any further privatisation of the NHS in England, and we will back any moves to restore it to a fully public service. Our plans will also mean more investment in housing. There is a substantial shortfall of affordable homes for rent across the UK. The Scottish Government is on track to meet our commitment to 30,000 new affordable homes in the 5 years to 2016, but more needs to be done. We will push for a UK-wide house building target of at least 100,000 new affordable homes each year, and we will use the extra investment to expand house building here in Scotland. Building more homes not only meets a vital social need, it is also good for the construction industry, for jobs and for our economy as a whole. And to support faster economic growth, we will press for a cut in employers' national insurance contributions. We want to see the employment allowance increase from £2,000 to £6,000 over the next 4 years to help smaller firms in particular take on and retain additional staff and support them in paying the living wage to all of their staff. It is measures like these that will help us grow the economy and create jobs. But we must also make sure that work pays. I can confirm today that SNP MPs will vote to increase the minimum wage to £8.70 by 2020. We will support tough action to crack down on zero-hours contracts. And we will press the UK Government to follow the lead of the Scottish Government and become a living wage employer. We will vote for measures to tackle the rising tide of poverty, including in-work poverty that is a direct result of the policies of austerity. We will oppose the £3 billion cut in disability support that threatens to cut the incomes of 1 million disabled people by more than £1,000 a year. We will support an increase in carers' allowance. We will vote to retain the triple lock on pensions, and we will protect the winter fuel allowance. We will support increases in tax credits and child benefits, at least in line with inflation, to avoid more of our children falling into poverty. We will vote for action to reduce energy bills, and we will also vote for the immediate abolition of the bedroom tax. Abolishing the bedroom tax would mean that the £35 million a year that the Scottish Government currently spends to mitigate the impact of the bedroom tax would be available to spend on other priorities. I can tell you today that we would choose to spend that money on measures to tackle and eventually eradicate the food poverty that is such a scandal in our rich country. All of these policies that SNP MPs will champion at Westminster are about building a stronger economy and a fairer society. That is also what drives our support for a more empowered Scottish Parliament. The SNP will always support independence, but this election But this election is not about independence. It is about making Scotland stronger. So we will use the influence of SNP votes at Westminster to ensure that promises made during the referendum are delivered. We will demand that the proposals of the Smith Commission are delivered quickly and in full. And let me say this directly to David Cameron today. We will oppose any effort to undermine the Scottish Parliament. We will seek agreement that the Scottish Parliament should move to full financial responsibility. And as part of a phased transition, we will prioritise early devolution of powers over employment policy, including the minimum wage, welfare, business taxes, national insurance and equality policy. The powers we need here in Scotland to create jobs, grow revenues and lift our people out of poverty. So these are the priorities that we will carry into this election and beyond. Priorities to make life better for ordinary people, not just in Scotland, but across the UK. A real alternative to austerity, a higher minimum wage, protection for our National Health Service, action to boost growth in our economy, and a determination to tackle the poverty that blights too many lives. This is a manifesto bursting with ideas and ambition. It is a manifesto first and foremost for Scotland, but it has real relevance and it can bring real benefits to the whole of the UK as well. A vote for this SNP Manifesto on May the 7th will make Scotland's voice heard at Westminster more strongly than it has ever been before. And a stronger voice for Scotland will mean a stronger voice for new, better and more progressive politics at Westminster for everyone. My vow is to make Scotland stronger at Westminster. To the people of Scotland, I say this: with your support on May the 7th, we can secure a much better future for you, for your family and for Scotland. Thank you very much.
Nicola Sturgeon launching the SNP Manifesto, a manifesto that she says is first and foremost for Scotland, but she said it can bring benefits to the whole of the UK as well. She said that if the SNP emerges from this general election stronger, it will exercise its influence responsibly and constructively in the interests of people across the whole of the UK. We're expecting that she will shortly take questions from the audience there. But let's just bring in Norman Smith, our assistant political editor, who is there. So Norman, she was very much speaking not just to those who actually can vote SNP, but potentially those who will also be impacted on by the potential power of the SNP after this election.
Yeah, Nicola Sturgeon getting the rock star treatment at the moment. I hope you can hear me above the music. I thought the key thing was two words: fear and friendship. The argument of David Cameron is that voters should fear the influence of the SNP on a Labour government. Nicola Sturgeon saying she holds out the hand of friendship to voters in the rest of the UK, that the sort of policies contained in here she believes would be of benefit to the whole of the UK, and policies many of which are in line with a lot of existing Labour policies. So, for example, she said they would support the abolition of the bedroom tax, they would support the introduction of the 50p top rate of tax, they would support raising the minimum wage. A whole range of policies which are also Labour policies, but also other policies much harder for Ed Miliband to agree to. For example, ending austerity altogether, when we know Ed Miliband has said year on year there will still have to be cuts in unprotected government departments. And critically, she restated her party's opposition to Trident, again a non-negotiable for Labour. The question mark is, do voters outside of the United Kingdom view her as an ally, as she sees it, for progressive politics, or a threat who might possibly impose policies which people in England hadn't voted on? But I think Nicola Sturgeon is probably just about to take some questions from the audience.
In the media, I want to ask you, before I open up for questions in the media, to treat this part of the proceedings today with respect. The media are here today to do a very important and a very legitimate job, and that is to scrutinise the manifesto that we are publishing today. So even if you don't like the questions that they ask, they have a right to ask those questions, and I have a responsibility to seek to answer those questions. So I would ask you to listen to the questions in silence, although you should feel free to applaud my answers as loudly as you want. Okay, I'm going to start with a question from James Cook of the BBC.
Thanks very much indeed. Over to your left, if you're looking down.
Yes.
Thank you. For years, the SNP complained bitterly that right-wing policies were imposed on Scotland against the country's wishes. Now, you're effectively saying you want to impose left-wing policies on England, possibly against its wishes. Are you not basically a hypocrite who's holding the UK to ransom?
I take a very different view of that. I'm not seeking to impose policies on anybody. I'm seeking for support in Scotland for the manifesto that I am publishing today, and I'm saying very clearly that I want to seek to build common cause and to forge alliances with people of like mind across the UK so that we can win more progressive change. I, as you know, James, fought the referendum campaign last year with all my heart and soul. I campaigned hard for a yes vote. During that campaign, politicians from Westminster came to Scotland, as it was entirely their right to do, and urged Scotland, and I think this is a direct quote, not to leave the UK, but to lead the UK. Now, Scotland did not vote in the referendum to become independent. We remain part of the Westminster system, and therefore I think it is entirely legitimate, and I think it is important for Scotland that we seek to make our voice heard in that system and to encourage and to use our influence to encourage the Westminster system to take better decisions. Because as long as we remain a part of it, it matters to people in Scotland that the decisions made at Westminster are good decisions. And that's why I say to people watching in other parts of the UK that it is in the interests of the SNP speaking up for Scotland to work constructively in that system to make it better. And I happen to think as we do that, we can get better politics and better policies for people right across the UK who are as desperate for change as people in Scotland are right now. James Matthews from Sky.
First Minister, you're a party that supports Scottish independence. You're talking about cooperation with MPs in the north of England and in Wales. Not content with breaking Scotland out of the UK, are you now penciling political fault lines elsewhere around the UK? And second of all, can I ask your reaction to what Boris Johnson has had to say this morning? That giving the SNP power in a Westminster government would be like putting King Herod in charge of a baby farm.
Okay, I did say you might not like some of the questions, and that is not the fault of Mr. Matthews from Sky. Can I say, in response to that, first of all, I haven't heard the comments of Boris Johnson directly this morning, so it's perhaps not entirely fair of me to comment on them. But if he did say that, then that's an entirely offensive comment, and I think it will be treated as such, not just by people in Scotland, but people across the UK, who, in my experience of ordinary people, the length and breadth of the UK, do not see Scotland in that way at all, and do not even see the SNP in that way at all. In terms of the first part, of your question, the short answer is no. I'm not seeking in this election to create division with or between anybody. I make no secret of the fact that I want Scotland to be an independent country. But I'm a Democrat. Scotland did not vote to be independent last year, and if Scotland is ever to become independent, then a majority of people in Scotland need to vote for that in a referendum. Right now, we remain part of the UK. We remain part of the Westminster system, and therefore my interest is in seeking to build alliances across the UK for better politics and for better policies, because that will help people in Scotland. And as a politician, I have spent my entire political career arguing for what I consider to be in the best interests of Scotland. People will not always agree that what I argue for is in the best interests of Scotland, but that is entirely my motivation. So in this election, I am offering to people elsewhere in the UK a genuine hand of friendship. I'm not trying to hide my political beliefs as far as independence is concerned, but I am saying very clearly we can work together to get the change that people in Scotland want, and in my experience, many people across the rest of these islands want as well. I accept the responsibility to be the one to persuade people in other parts of the UK that my entreaties in that regard are genuine, and I take that responsibility seriously. It matters to Scotland to get better policies at Westminster, and if we can use our voice to do that, we benefit people not just in Scotland, but everywhere across these islands as well. And I'll go next to Brian Taylor from BBC Scotland.
First Minister, thanks very much indeed. The point you made there about cooperating, taking that point. David Cameron, nonetheless, is saying it will be a frightening prospect if your party has influence on the governance of the UK. If we take that to its ultimate logic, is it possible, is it feasible, is it even desirable in your view that Scottish independence might come about through the back door of English disquiet rather than the front door of Scottish determination?
Okay, I was actually in the wings of a television studio watching as David Cameron made those comments in the BBC in London yesterday. I'm told, although I'm not sure if it's true, but I am told that he was not keen to sit next to me on the sofa of the BBC while he made the comments. I'll leave him to confirm or deny if that was the case. Yeah, I go back to what I said earlier on. David Cameron was one of those politicians who entirely legitimately sought to persuade and ultimately successfully persuaded people in Scotland to vote against independence on the basis that Scotland's voice could and would be heard within the Westminster system. If Scotland chooses now, as it is democratically entitled to do, to make its voice heard by voting SNP, then it is completely outrageous and unacceptable for any Westminster politician to say to Scotland that that's not acceptable. It's tantamount to saying your voice will be heard as long as you vote the way we want you to vote, and that's not democratic. And secondly, lastly, on the point about independence, let me make crystal clear there is no back door to Scottish independence. There is only the route of persuading a majority of people to vote for independence in a referendum. There is no back door, there is no shortcut, there is no easy route. And I take this responsibility very seriously. I will spend every day that I am privileged to hold the office that I hold in seeking to persuade people in other parts of the UK that, notwithstanding that they might disagree with the SNP on the question of independence, that we can nevertheless be allies for progressive change. That's what I have sought to do in this campaign so far. It is what I will seek to do for every remaining day of this campaign, and it's how SNP MPs will conduct themselves in the House of Commons for each and every day that they're given the privilege of serving there. Claire Stewart, STV.
Nicola, full fiscal responsibility, as it's now called, made it onto the second last page of the manifesto, but it is in there, so will you now give us full costings? And will you also detail where money is coming from for pledges like 9.5 billion for the NHS?
Okay. In terms of full financial responsibility, first of all, I said in my opening remarks that is something that we will seek agreement on. Full fiscal and financial responsibility is, of course, about giving the Scottish Parliament the powers to grow our economy, the powers to create revenues, get more people into jobs so that they're paying taxes and our revenues are growing. Even if we reach an agreement on full fiscal responsibility, we know from the experience of the Calman Commission it will take several years for that to be fully implemented, and that is the reality we know from experience. It's therefore irrelevant to use, as the opposition do, a figure from now, it's no more relevant than it would be if I picked a figure from one of the 7 out of the last 10 years when Scotland's been in a stronger fiscal position than the rest of the UK. Our fiscal position when Scotland becomes fiscally and financially responsible, autonomous, will depend on our economic growth between now and then. It will depend on the detail of the fiscal framework that is agreed, and in that SNP MPs will have a critical part to play in getting the best deal for Scotland. And as part of that transition, what I want to do is win as many powers in the key areas for Scotland as possible. Powers over employment, the minimum wage, business taxes, to get more people into jobs and to grow our economy. Because the only alternative to that, and why Labour in particular, I think, wants to spend so much time talking about this, the only alternative to that is the cuts that Labour and the Tories are proposing. If we want a genuine long-term alternative to austerity, then the more powers we have in our own hands to grow our economy and make a better future for this country, the better. In terms of the second part of your question, Claire, we set out in this manifesto an alternative approach to public finances. We reject the continued cuts of Labour and the Tories, and we say that we want to see modest spending increases over the life of the next Parliament in each year of the next Parliament. We will still, under that plan, see the debt and the deficit fall in each year as a share of our national income, but we will, and we are saying this very openly, under that plan we would take longer to completely eliminate the deficit. And what that does is make available an additional £140 billion to invest in things like our NHS, in economic growth, in lifting people out of poverty. We're also setting out in the manifesto revenue-raising measures that we would support. I mentioned in my opening remarks the top rate of tax going back to 50p, support for a mansion tax, support for a banker's bonus tax. So these are the ways in which we will fund all of the commitments in this manifesto, and all of the commitments, spending commitments we make in this manifesto that we would vote for and push for at Westminster are affordable within that framework that we're setting out. We of course also say where we would spend money differently, and I use again the example of Trident. That's a very, very real way in which we can free up resources to spend on giving our children a better future. So this is a fiscally responsible manifesto, but it's one that also says we need to reduce the deficit in a way that does not tear up the fabric of our society, and I am proud to stand on that premise. Martin Geisler, ITN.
First Minister, you said today that those with the broadest shoulders should pay a little bit more, but you haven't used the opportunity to raise tax in 8 years in government here. In fact, can you remind us of a single meaningful redistributive policy you have implemented, taking middle-class money and giving it to the less well-off? Well,
in terms of the tax-raising powers, we don't have the power to raise tax on those with the broadest shoulders. At the moment, all we can do is raise the basic rate. All we can do right now is raise or lower the basic rate of income tax by 3p. And I wouldn't describe those paying the basic rate of income tax as those with the broadest shoulders. Now, the Scottish Parliament will be... The Scottish Parliament will, of course, be getting additional tax varying powers starting in 2016, and we hope more to come after that. And we will consider in the normal course of setting our budgets, the Finance Secretary is here today listening very carefully, we will consider how we use those tax varying powers that the Scottish Parliament has to meet the objectives that I'm setting out in this manifesto. In terms of the policies we have pursued, progressive policies to help those most in need of help, there are many that I can cite. We've, for example, taken action to ensure that council tax benefit is not taken away from the poorest people in our society. We're investing every year right now more than £100 million in mitigating the impact of Tory welfare cuts, including taking away entirely the impact of the bedroom tax. The council tax freeze proportionately helps those at the bottom more than it does those at the top. Unlike governments south of the border, we have retained educational maintenance allowances, allowing those from most deprived communities the opportunity to stay in and further their education. We have been and we will continue to be a progressive Scottish Government, and we will also argue for and vote for progressive policies in Westminster as well. And Alec Thompson from Channel 4.
Good morning. Why do you think the English are scared of you?
I don't think they are. And if you want my honest opinion, although I shouldn't be running the risk of giving David Cameron any unintended good advice, but I think he's making a huge tactical and strategic mistake in assuming that people are. My experience, and it's anecdotal, is that people across the rest of the UK are as hungry and restless for progressive change as people in Scotland are. And I think we can play a positive part in helping to bring about that change. What I would say, and I've alluded to it already today, is that I take seriously my responsibility to say to anybody in other parts of the UK who may be suspicious about the motives of the SNP that we will play a positive and constructive role. Because, dare I say it, I can understand why some people in other parts of the UK may wonder why a party that wants independence for Scotland could play that constructive role. The answer to that is very, very simple. As long as we're part of that system, it matters to us that that system serves all of us better. And that's why we will play a constructive role. And my final point, which I should stress is entirely anecdotal, is that my inbox is heaving with people from other parts of the UK asking if they can vote SNP. And next is Andy Bell, Channel 5.
Thank you very much. Andy Bell, 5 News. If a minority Labour government doesn't do what you want it to do, are you going to vote against them and risk putting the Conservatives in, or are you going to keep that minority Labour government in place and just torture them for 5 years? I'm going to do neither of those things. Let me say this sincerely, and again, in some respects my comments here are directed as much to people outside of Scotland as they are to people in Scotland. I am not, and the SNP is not going into this election seeking the election of SNP MPs in order that we can go to Westminster to be in any way destructive or disruptive. I am not going to Westminster at all. The SNP is not going to Westminster. The SNP is not going to Westminster to seek to bring down governments or block budgets. We are going to Westminster to build alliances for good, positive, progressive, sensible change. And we will do that constructively, looking to make common cause with people of like mind. I know, and I know this for a fact, that there are many, many people within the ranks of the Labour Party, perhaps not in the Labour leadership, although there is one shadow minister in Scotland who was quoted last week as saying he would never in any circumstances vote for the renewal of Trident. There are many people within Labour who I think hear what the SNP says and perhaps agree with it more than they agree with some of what their own leadership says. So we will seek to build those alliances for change, and as I've said on many occasions during this campaign, as I said as recently as yesterday, the Fixed Terms Parliament Act gives parties the opportunity to do that, to seek to persuade governments to change on particular issues without bringing governments down, and it's that constructive role that we'll seek to play. Allegra Stratton from Newsnight.
Nicola Sturgeon, following on from that question, if Ed Miliband chose to make his budget an issue of confidence in him, can you tell us now, would you support that budget?
Look, we will seek to persuade and build alliances for the kind of policies we want to see to be in the budget. I'm not going into this, and I'm not going to be drawn into implying that the SNP is going into Westminster to try to block budgets or bring governments down. We want to use our influence to make change, and that's what we will seek to do. And the more SNP MPs we get elected on the 7th of May, the more influence we will have and the more able we will be to make that change. So that's my message. If you want Scotland's voice to be heard, if you want a Labour government's budget to be better, if you want a Labour government not to be Tory light but to be bold and better and progressive, then vote SNP to make sure that all of these things can happen. Peter. I'll take a quick question from Peter McMahon from Border Television before going on to the newspaper journalists.
First Minister, David Cameron is supposedly going to set out today what he's going to call the Carlisle principle. In other words, that under a Tory government, a UK government would assess the impact of policies in Scotland on people south of the border. Could I have your reaction to that, please? Also, your manifesto says that we will back budget plans to invest more in infrastructure of Scotland and the north of England. Now, that might be very appealing to people in, say, the northeast of England, but can you be more specific, please?
Well, firstly, in response to David Cameron's comments today, I think they are born out of panic and desperation on the part of the Prime Minister, frankly. I also think they will appall people across Scotland. They're a clear attempt to undermine the principle and the practice of devolution. There's also something of an irony to hear the Prime Minister of a government that's racked up hundreds of billions of pounds worth of debt saying that it's going to, and I think the quote was, check the homework of a government that's balanced the books in every single year we've been in office. The whole point of more powers for the Scottish Parliament is so that we can use those powers well and wisely to take good decisions, to get our economy growing and to reap the benefits of the revenues that result from that economic growth. We take the risk of exercising power in the Scottish Parliament. We should also reap the benefit when we get those decisions right. So I will oppose, and the SNP will oppose, any attempt by any Tory Prime Minister to undermine the Scottish Parliament, and I hope David Cameron hears that loudly and clearly today. And on the second part of your question, I'm passionate about building more links between Scotland and the north of England, particularly the south of Scotland. You would be familiar with the Borderlands initiative, looking at how we work together to create more economic opportunity for Scotland and for the north of England. We set out in our manifesto the objective and the desire to see the economy of the UK rebalanced so that it benefits those in the northern parts of the UK as much as it does those in the southern parts. And one particular example we've put forward is high-speed rail, wanting to see that go from north to south at the same time as it goes from south to north, so that it benefits Scotland and the north of England. And it's one tangible example of how we can work together to deliver that change. Okay. I have a forest of hands. David Clegg, I think, is rising most quickly. David Clegg from the Daily Record.
Thank you. Two questions. One, given that you're most likely to be able to wield influence if there's a minority Labour government, will you call on people in England to vote Labour? And secondly, would you support the extra money for Wales called for by your friends in Plaid Cymru, given you're also calling for their keeping the Warnock formula?
Okay, I'm not going to tell people in England how to vote, other than to say look at your candidates and vote for the most progressive candidate. If that happens to be a Labour candidate, then vote for that candidate. I want to be able to build progressive alliances in the House of Commons, and the more progressive MPs we get there, including Labour MPs, the more in England, the more chance we will have of doing that. And I do support Leanne Wood and Plaid Cymru's call for parity for Wales, but not at the expense not at the expense of Scotland, because I do not accept that Scotland is subsidised, and I will argue passionately against that notion for as long as I'm in politics. But, you know, the most important thing I would say in response to the first part of your question is this. In Scotland, we can only control in this election what we do. And if we want to make sure that Scotland's voice is heard in a way that it's not been heard at Westminster before, and if we want to make sure that all of the MPs we send to Westminster are arguing for the progressive politics and the progressive change that we believe in, then you have to vote SNP to elect SNP MPs to be that progressive voice for Scotland. So that is what I'll persuade people to do in terms of their voting practice on May the 7th. I don't think I'm grabbing any headlines with what I'm going to say here, but if you live in Scotland, please, please vote SNP. Yes, so, who's next? Who's got the microphone? Yes, sorry. Yes.
Thank you. Sam Coates from The Times. Sam Coates from The Times. You talk about wanting to stop a Tory-like government. Do you really think the rest of the UK wants a more left-wing administration than the one that Ed Miliband has to offer? And you're talking about trying to oust David Cameron and put Ed Miliband in as Prime Minister, and I'm interested in what you think of him. Do you think that he is as tough as Gordon Brown, as wily as Tony Blair? What do you make of him? Is he a strong opponent?
On the first part of your question, I think, it's my opinion, but I'll express it. I think the fact that neither Labour or the Tories seem capable of winning a majority at this election, all of the polls suggest that neither of them is going to manage to win a majority, does suggest very strongly that people in England want something different from both of them in terms of what they're offering now. If that wasn't the case, then one or other of them would presumably be well on their way to winning a majority. The state of the opinion polls, I think, sends a very strong message that neither of those parties are offering what people want. I think in terms of Labour, that's because they're not offering a clear enough difference to the Tories. You know, Ed Miliband asked me at the debate last week if I was really saying that there was nothing to choose between him and David Cameron. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there's not enough to choose between him and David Cameron, and he should be bolder. In terms of Ed Miliband, I've only now, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, met Ed Miliband on 3 occasions. I got into a bit of trouble last week when I said the first time was at the opening ceremony of the Commonwealth Games, and I ventured the view that on that occasion I was more interested in watching the dancing tea cakes than I was in speaking to other politicians. And that was not intended to be any slight on Ed Miliband at all. The same was true of Alex Salmond, so there you go. Can I say seriously, this is not about one politician being in the pocket of another politician or vice versa. I actually think it's about something better and more positive than that. I think it's about different politicians listening to what the voters say and coming together to work together to deliver the change that voters want. That's what I'm determined to do.
Hi there, Cameron Brooks, Press and Journal. If the SNP are in a position, will you make sure that Scotland's Fisheries Minister will lead the fishing negotiations in any EU talks? And also, what message do you have to people, small business owners, who feel they will really struggle to pay the minimum wage of £8.70 an hour?
Okay. Firstly, in terms of Fisheries Minister leading discussions, you know, Cameron, that is a position we have argued long and hard over a long period of time. When there are matters being discussed in the European Union that directly affect the fishing industry in Scotland, it is, in my view, outrageous and unacceptable that the Scottish Fishing Minister does not lead for Scotland in that respect. So yes, that is something we will continue to advance as an argument. And again, the stronger voice we have in Westminster, the more able we will be and the more likely we will be to prevail on arguments of that nature. In terms of your very legitimate and important question about small business owners, I should say, firstly, the pledge in the manifesto is to increase the minimum wage to £8.70 by 2020. It's a phased increase, but it recognises that we must do more for those at the bottom end of the income scale to lift them out of poverty. Because if we do that, then we have fewer people dependent on tax credits and we save the country money as well. But I recognise, and I recognise through the work the Scottish Government is currently doing to promote the living wage through the Living Wage Accreditation Scheme, that often for small businesses, their inability to pay the minimum, or the minimum wage is a legal requirement, of course, but inability to pay the living wage is not because they don't want to, it's because they practically cannot. So that's why the Living Wage Accreditation Scheme provides support, and it's why in this manifesto we're making a very specific commitment to argue for and vote for further reductions in employers' national insurance contributions, to give them the support and the incentives to employ more people and to make sure these people get paid properly. My eyesight is starting to fail me. I see your hand, so I will come over here, but yes.
It's James Cusick from The Independent. A bookmaker this morning offered me fairly decent odds that a second referendum would be held within the next 5 years. Do you think I should take the bet?
Well, if my predecessor was standing here, he'd probably be able to give you some advice. I am not a betting person, so I'm going to but no, I don't think I would. I'm not planning another referendum. I have made that absolutely clear. I've also said that there is a democratic lock on the question of another referendum. Something substantive would have to change in our circumstances from the referendum last year to justify it being in a future manifesto. And by that, let me make clear, I don't mean an SNP win in the Westminster election. I am being absolutely clear. If you vote SNP on May the 7th, you are not voting to give the SNP a mandate for a second referendum. So something substantial would have to change. And then, of course, people in Scotland would have to vote for that manifesto to elect a government with sufficient strength in the Scottish Parliament to pass the legislation. I cannot impose a referendum on anybody. It's the people of Scotland who are in charge at every step of the way. Right, Seb, before that arm falls off, I'm going to allow you to ask a question.
Severing Crowell at The Guardian. First Minister, was Stuart Hosey correct to say on the 28th of March that the SNP would expect to have advanced negotiations with Labour Party if they became a minority government on the SNP, on the Labour's Queen's speech? That you would expect to have some form of a veto on the Queen's speech?
Look, I said earlier on, I am not leading the SNP into this election and will not lead the SNP into whatever scenario follows this election to try to block or disrupt or bring down. I will lead the SNP to be a constructive force at Westminster. And beyond that, all I would say is this. We can all, and it's understandable, and we're all prone to do it at the moment, given the state of the polls, to get very caught up in what happens the morning after the 7th of May. People have to vote on the 7th of May first. And the SNP will only be in the position to wield any influence and to have any voice on Scotland's behalf if people on the 7th of May vote for their SNP candidate. So let's persuade people to do that first. And then when the votes are cast, and we see what the numbers say afterwards, we will decide how we take things forward then. But the people have to be allowed their say before that happens. Yes.
First Minister, Scott McNabb from the Scotsman. A formal coalition with Labour looks unlikely, but we may have, according to the hints we're getting, some kind of informal pact or arrangement. In that scenario, if you have 40 to 50 MPs at Westminster, would you want to see one of them maybe in the Scotland office as Minister of State?
I'm not. I don't think a formal coalition is likely. I've always said that. Ed Miliband says he doesn't want that either. So I do not envisage a situation where we have SNP ministers in a Labour government. And that really is not the motive for SNP MPs going to Westminster. We go to stand up for Scotland and to get the best deal for Scotland and to make Scotland's voice heard. And when we see how people vote and when we see the breakdown of the numbers the day after the election, we'll be able to judge how we best do that. But all I'll say, as I've said repeatedly, is we will do that always constructively and positively. But we're not there to get ministerial positions, we're there to stand up for Scotland. Okay, please pray silence for a young up-and-coming journalist, Mr. Alan Cochrane of the Daily Telegraph.
First Minister, there's a lot of talk here about negotiations perhaps with an incoming Labour government. Are you going to base yourself in London for these negotiations on, say, May the 8th in the Caledonian Club, for instance? I can put you up for membership.
Are you offering to put me up, Alan?
I'll put you up, happily. No, put you up for membership. You can't share. Will you take charge of these negotiations personally? I know you've got a deputy already, possibly a member of the Westminster Parliament. You've also got a predecessor, I think, who might be there. Will you take charge of these negotiations, or will you try and do it from 400 miles away?
I am the leader of the SNP. I'll be in charge of any discussions, negotiations, or whatever happens after the 8th of May. And that's my short answer to that. Okay. Right, I think we've got time for one more question. Dickie from the Financial Times.
Thank you, Murray, Financial Times. In the manifesto, you refer to full financial responsibility, but in the past, the SNP has called for full fiscal autonomy. Can you tell us if there's any difference between the two? The same thing. And can you explain a little bit about your thinking of not prioritising that as a goal in post-election negotiations? Thank you.
No, I don't draw any distinction. It's a matter of terminology. I make the point and use the term financial responsibility to make clear that that's what we're seeking, the responsibility to grow our economy and increase our revenues as a country. I set out very clearly that we will seek agreement to Scotland moving to financial responsibility. I'm simply reflecting the reality of the position. You know, the Calman proposals were made in 2009, and it will not be until next year that the tax powers, the income tax powers that flow from these proposals come into force. So it will take a period of time. What is really important then is that as part of that process, we prioritise early devolution of the powers that allow us to get to work as quickly as possible to grow our economy. And that, in terms of more powers, will be the priority that SNP MPs give to those discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, can I thank you for your attendance here today? Can I thank ladies and gentlemen of the press for their attendance here today? To my colleagues in the SNP, can I simply say this? None of this talk about what happens after the 7th of May will mean anything unless we win this election on the 7th of May. We take nothing for granted. We take not a single vote in this election for granted. To the people of Scotland, let me say this very clearly. Between now and polling day, we will work as hard as we can to earn your trust. And if you give us your trust on polling day, we will repay that trust by making Scotland's voice heard, standing up for Scotland, protecting Scotland's interests, and being MPs in Westminster that you can be proud of. Thank you very much.